Nintendo painted some great portable gaming with the Game Boy Color. Eight-bit joystick. The Game Boy had already been out for 9 years when Nintendo released the Game Boy Color in 1998. They were also hard at work on the Game Boy Advance, but after Pokemon took the world by storm, the Game Boy Color is exactly what Pokemon gamers wanted. I'm going to cover 15 essential Game Boy Color games, and then I'm going to go into all the best ways to play Game Boy games in 2024. But you better subscribe because next week I'm going to take a look at all the essential Game Boy Advance games. The Game Boy Color is often overlooked, and that's too bad because there really are some great games on it. Now, on to the games. Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX. Hands down, one of the best launch titles for the Game Boy Color was Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX. It was an enhanced remake of the original Link's Awakening, which was one of the best Zelda games ever made, but with color graphics and additional challenging dungeons that are only available on the Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Color. Since it is a black Game Boy cartridge, the rest of the game also works on original grayscale Nintendo hardware. Link is shipwrecked on Koholint Island, and to get home, Link must collect 8 magical instruments to awaken the Windfish, the local deity. It has a ton of charm and quirky characters, and the DX version adds improved visuals and gameplay. There was the recent Nintendo Switch remake, but there's just such a huge amount of charm from Nintendo's 8-bit character sprites that I don't think that you get that from the 3D version. Link's Awakening DX is a must-play game on the Game Boy Color. Shantae. Shantae is one of the best genre-bending platformers ever made, and it is first on the Game Boy Color. This is the first game starring Shantae, the lovable titular half-genie hero. She can jump and whip bad guys with her hair, and she can learn dance moves to transform into a nimble monkey, a mermaid, or a powerful elephant for smashing bad guys in your fight against Lady Pirate Risky Boots and her pirate minion hordes. The price of this cartridge has really gone up in recent years, so I would recommend that you play it however you can, including the 2020 limited run cartridge release and the digital versions on modern hardware. The original Shantae is full of intricate platforming, charm, and humor. It is a shame that 8-bit platformers were still going on in 2002, but were underappreciated at the time. Pokemon Gold, Silver, Crystal. Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal was the first entirely new Pokemon game after the original series became a global phenomena on the original Game Boy. It is yet another adventure of a kid setting off to become a Pokemon master, and you can play as a male or female hero for the first time in the game series. There is also a lot of quality of life improvements, and it represented a bit more of a challenge than the original Pokemon trilogy of games on the Game Boy. Not only is there the all-new Johto and 100 new Pokemon, but the original Kanto region and the original Pokemon are included in the game but remade in color. Rather than reimagining itself with each game generation, Nintendo went with a slow and steady iterative approach and expanded on the previous generation of Pokemon games. Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal are well beloved by millions of Pokemon gamers all over the world. Wario Land 2. Wario Land 2 is a direct sequel to Super Mario Land 3, in which Wario became the protagonist, and the gameplay and level design is quite different compared to Mario-centered games. Instead of just running and jumping centric Mario games, the Wario Land games tend to emphasize a lot of puzzle elements and platforming based combat. Wario wakes up to find Captain Syrup and her band of pirate goons have plundered his castle, stolen his loot, and flooded the place. Wario sets sail across 5 worlds from tropical beaches to underwater ruins to reclaim his hoard of loot and to unleash cartoon revenge. There is an emphasis on exploration and puzzle solving and power-ups that can give you the ability to chomp enemies. As a black cartridge, it plays on both the original Game Boy hardware in monochrome or on the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance in color. Wario Land 2 is a result of Nintendo taking some creative risks that pay off with a fun and different cartoon platformer game from Nintendo. Mega Man Xtreme. With Mega Man Xtreme, Capcom took the 16-bit Mega Man X game and created a charming 8-bit version on the Game Boy Color. They didn't just take the original game and use the same level layout, but they rebalanced and reconfigured it for Nintendo's portable platform. You still play as Mega Man X, fighting through 8 stages against robotic bosses, but there are 4 new robot masters and a ton of hidden capsules and power-ups and alternate paths through the stages. The Game Boy Color sits right there as a legit 8-bit game system, but it came out after the 16-bit era and well into the 32-bit era. It has a bunch of great games like this one that feel respectful to the 8-bit era, but also are a part of modern gaming of the day. The Mega Man Xtreme games are quite good, and I'm surprised that they don't get more attention and affection. Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid, also known as Metal Gear Ghost Babel, is a bit of a throwback because it is a new 2D Metal Gear game made after Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation. It is a deliberately retro game, but it also has a lot of the same stealth combat action that the Metal Gear series is known for and loved for. By going back to 2D sprites, it really goes back to the MSX/NES roots of Metal Gear. It still has a pretty deep, complex storyline and a ton of witty banter, but despite coming out in 2000, it really feels like going back to the 1980s. Don't miss out on this one. It really is a sneaker hit or a sleeper hit. Dragon Warrior 1 and 2. Dragon Quest is the game series that turned the role-playing game into a national pastime in Japan and helped create the entire concept of the JRPG. Dragon Quest wasn't the first role-playing game on a console, but it did popularize the genre. It starts off as a hero setting out to rescue the land, save a princess or two, kill a couple slimes, and stop the evil Dragon Lord from doing evil things. In 1993, Enix updated the first 2 Dragon Quest games and released them on the Super Famicom. Then, in 1999, they made a portable version based on the updated version. This gives this a 1980s JRPG feel because that's exactly what it is. There are charming pixelated towns, treacherous dungeons, first-person turn-based fights against iconic monsters like slimes and metal slimes in classic turn-based battles. It is not just a straight port, but Enix included enhanced graphics, streamlined gameplay, and a wealth of side quests and improvements. The Game Boy Color was released around the time when Squaresoft was in the early stages of their breakup with Nintendo, and they started romancing Sony with their PlayStation and Bandai with their WonderSwan. They had yet to merge with Enix, so Enix took advantage of Square's absence on the Game Boy Color, and Enix made sure that there were plenty of Dragon Quest games on it. If you've never played through a Dragon Quest game, then this is an excellent opportunity to do so on the Game Boy Color. Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. The Game Boy Color existed at a time before emulation became popular, so the logical way to get classic games on new platforms was to make a port of them, and that's what they did with Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. It is an enhanced port of the original Super Mario Bros., but they also included Super Mario Bros. 2 for the Famicom Disk System, the much harder sequel that was previously only released in the US as Super Mario The Lost Levels. So, the original Super Mario Bros. Was so incredibly painstakingly designed around the screen and hardware limitations of the Famicom that they wanted it to be faithful to the original level design, so they had to incorporate the smaller screen real estate of the Game Boy Color. In order to do this, the screen scrolls around left and right and up and down. It's not exactly a free-scrolling Mario game where you can't go all the way to the left, but just a little bit in order to encounter the virtual screen border of the original game. Nintendo also added a 2-player versus mode that lets you race a friend to the flagpole, and the Toy Box minigame collection offers hours of brick-breaking, Whack-A-Koopa, and coin-collecting modes where you replay a level looking for certain hidden coins. Well, it absolutely is a faithful port of probably the most classic Nintendo video game of all time to Nintendo's latest platform, but they added a lot of new stuff, and Super Mario Bros. Deluxe is pretty awesome, even if you know the original game by heart. Tetris DX. With a Game Boy Color, Nintendo set out to update the Game Boy line, but not completely reinvent it. So, it makes sense that they would bring the most popular Game Boy game of all time, Tetris, to the Game Boy Color. Tetris DX is a very good update to Tetris, but with crisp, colorful graphics and new music. Gone is the classical music, and in its place is newer techno tunes. The good news is that they didn't mess up Tetris by introducing a ton of changes to how the game is played. However, they did add a Marathon Plus mode where the game gets faster and throws invisible bricks at you, and Ultra mode where you try to clear 40 lines as fast as possible. And they also included a new AI versus mode where you can play competitive 2-player style Tetris but against the computer. Tetris DX is an excellent choice, colorful even if you've put thousands of hours playing the original black and green version. R-Type DX. Irene started off the Game Boy Color with a near arcade-accurate home port of R-Type that includes both Part 1 and Part 2 of the arcade game. R-Type was one of the first spaceship shooters that had you use the risk and reward of charging shots to deliver a bigger punch against bigger bad guys, but it made you vulnerable for that time that you had to charge. And a semi-autonomous but indestructible option pod that you could either attach to the front or rear of your ship for power-ups, or you could send it out to face the spaceship bad guys alone. This version also includes the DX mode, which combines the two games. This is one of the all-time classic shmup spaceship shooter games, but previously was only available on the original Game Boy, the Sega Master System, or the TurboGrafx 16. It is fitting since Irene has been a long-time Nintendo developer, but this game did not get a chance to get popular on Nintendo hardware until now. Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Seasons. Nintendo released not one Legend of Zelda game, but 2 intimately linked Legend of Zelda games for the Game Boy Color at the same time. Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. These were developed by Studio Flagship, which was a semi-independent video game company which was funded by Nintendo, Sega, and Capcom. This was the first Legend of Zelda game directed by Hidemaru Fujibayashi, who would later go on to develop Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. In this game, you can use the Rod of Seasons to shift the climate of the land to solve various puzzles. The environment will change between spring, summer, winter, and fall, and this will affect the various plants and environments to help you solve puzzles. There is quite a lot of action in this game. You can interact with the two Legend of Zelda games by using passwords or the Game Link cable and two Game Boys. You might think that this sounds crazy to release two different Legend of Zelda games on the same day, but many fans bought both of them and they sold almost the exact number of copies. Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Ages. Not only does Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages share a very similar plot as Oracle of Seasons, it shares the same engine, the same development team, and was released on the same day. That being said, they are not the same game, and in Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages, Link must travel through time to stop an evil villain sorceress who kidnaps the Oracle of Time and then manipulates the past to create a future of evil. Link, of course, has to track down several different magical items and eventually uses them to help the Maku tree save the Oracle of Time and restore the future. As you play the games, some of the characters will mention passwords which you can then enter in the other game to unlock certain magical rings. If you play both games back to back and use passwords, there is a new chapter where Princess Zelda is captured and Ganon is resurrected. Both games take place in the land of Labyrinthia. These two games were made by much of the same team that went on to make the Minish Cap on the Game Boy Advance, and then later those Legend of Zelda games on the Wii U and Nintendo Switch. A lot of people passed up these games because they were two-dimensional games made in the era of 3D gaming, and it is a shame because they are really good Nintendo-made Legend of Zelda games. The older I get, the more I appreciate games with classic 2D sprite work and hand-drawn pixel graphics. Mario Golf. Nintendo and Camelot Software Planning made a golf RPG starring Mario and friends on the Game Boy Color. There's actually a story-heavy adventure featuring a ton of human characters that are not Mario and friends. But instead of RPG fights, you play rounds of golf. You can even level up your golfer and then transfer them to the N64 version using the transfer pack. But there's also a pretty normal and pretty well done golf game, but with Mario, Luigi, Bowser, and Peach, and they all have their own different strengths and weaknesses. Nintendo has had golf games on every major platform that they've had, and the Game Boy Color is no exception. Mario Golf for Game Boy Color is surprisingly good. The Grinch. The Grinch is based on the Jim Carrey The Grinch Who Stole Christmas movie, but it was developed by Konami Nagoya, and I definitely get the feeling that the game's designers really wanted to make a Metal Gear game, but instead they got tasked with making The Grinch. So, they made a really good Metal Gear game that wasn't a Metal Gear game, but it had the Grinch as you sneak around collecting presents, always on the lookout, and then on the run from the anti-Grinch patrol sentries of Whoville. The PlayStation 1 and Dreamcast Grinch games were not very good, and are widely regarded as being terrible, but the Grinch game on Game Boy Color, I think, is a hidden gem. It is way better than it should be. I mentioned this game in my Christmas video game video, and it bears repeating. The Grinch for Game Boy Color is a legitimate good game made by Konami and shouldn't be missed. Wario Land 3. With Wario Land 3, Wario actually surpasses Mario for starring in the most games in the Mario Land Wario Land series. It is another unique platformer made by Nintendo where you don't defeat enemies by jumping on them, but instead you can body slam, pick them up, and throw them into each other. There are also a number of really fun power-ups, such as Fat Wario, who can break through walls, and Metal Wario, who is immune to electrical shocks. With this game, Nintendo is really more about making a thought-provoking puzzle game than a straight-up action platformer jumping game. I actually didn't pay attention to these games when they were new, so I'm pretty stoked to get a chance to enjoy them these days while making these videos. Game Boy Color Hardware Overview. It is clear that Nintendo viewed the Game Boy Color as an evolution and not a revolution. It featured a sharp CPU that could either run at 4.9 MHz of the original Game Boy or at 8.38 MHz. It has a slightly smaller 3.2-inch reflective thin film transistor TFT color liquid crystal display with a resolution of 160 by 144 pixels at a 10 by 9 aspect ratio, same ratio and resolution as the original Game Boy, but it supports up to 56 colors on screen at the same time out of a total 32,000 colors. It has a serial I/O link cable port, like the Game Boy, and it uses the same cable as the Game Boy Lite, the Game Boy Pocket, but it has a different connector than the original Game Boy. It also has a serial infrared I/O blaster port, which wasn't used by too many games, but it was possible to send data from one to another via infrared light. The Game Boy Color was released in a variety of colors, including a very cool transparent purple. The one that I have is a transparent skeleton, which was only released in Japan. Best ways to play Game Boy in 2024. There are quite a lot of options of how to play Game Boy games in 2024, and my favorite way is to use original hardware, or at least a handheld gaming experience where you hold the system in your hand. Since the Game Boy is such an iconic portable console, I really favor portable handheld ways to play Game Boy games. I mean, the games will run fine on a monitor or a TV, but it is such a core part of the Game Boy experience is to have the entire portable system in your hand. Another awesome part is that modern rechargeable batteries are much cheaper and better than what we had back in the 80s and early 90s. Your options include original Nintendo hardware, modified Game Boy original hardware, official Nintendo TV solutions, portable handheld emulators, computer emulators, and FPGA. And I'm going to briefly go over them. Different kinds of Game Boy cartridge. With the exception of some special cartridges, there are 4 major types of Game Boy cartridges, and the color and design helps you know which systems it can be played on. Original gray Game Boy cartridges. When the Game Boy was first released in 1989, the cartridges were gray and region-free, so you could play them in any Game Boy system from around the world. This was a Nintendo first because they were notoriously region-locked before this. The gray Game Boy cartridges are the lowest common denominator and can be played on any Game Boy system that plays Game Boy games, which is any Game Boy except for the Game Boy Micro. Black Game Boy cartridges. The black Game Boy cartridges were released after the Game Boy Color, and they can be played in color on the Game Boy Color or on the original Game Boy in original monochrome. Clear transparent Game Boy Color cartridges. The clear Game Boy Color cartridges take advantage of the more powerful processor and color graphics on the Game Boy Color, and they only work on the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy Advance. Game Boy Advance cartridges. The smaller Game Boy Advance cartridges, of which there are many different colored designs, only work in a Game Boy Advance system, and that includes the Game Boy player for GameCube. Original hardware, of which there are many. Nintendo made different versions of the Game Boy line over the years, and they supported playing the original Game Boy cartridges from 1989 on all Game Boy systems until the Game Boy Micro in 2005 and the Nintendo DS in 2004. Original DMG Game Boy. What it plays? Original gray Game Boy cartridges and black Game Boy cartridges. The original Game Boy is iconic. It is tough and it's not without its charm. It's also not without its flaws. It's a lot bigger than a lot of modern portable systems, and the screen is not backlit, and it requires some pretty decent light and positioning of the system to get the most out of it. But even with the many flaws, the experience is meaningful and is such an overall part of the charm of the original Game Boy. Currently, I do not have a Game Boy Original DMG, even though I've had one in the past. I just bought a transparent one from J4U. However, Japan just had a pretty bad earthquake, and there's also the New Year's holiday, so it might be a while before I get my original Game Boy. Believe it or not, these have been going up in price in recent years, but there are still plenty of the original beige system. Screen burn can definitely be an issue, so you definitely want to try a used one out before buying one. Game Boy Pocket. What it plays. Original gray Game Boy cartridges and black Game Boy cartridges. Another excellent option is the Game Boy Pocket from 1996, and it is powered by AAA batteries. It features a pretty decent monochrome gray screen, but still has the signature Game Boy pixel blur. It is not backlit, but it sits right there at the point between the authentic original Game Boy experience, but with a lot of the modern conveniences and quality of life improvements. It is also a bit smaller and will easily fit into most pockets. Game Boy Lite. What it plays. Original gray Game Boy cartridges and black Game Boy cartridges. Nintendo actually made a backlit version of the Game Boy Pocket in 1998 called the Game Boy Lite, but then they only released it in Japan, which is a true shame. Even with a backlit screen, it could get 12 hours of gameplay off batteries. And it is a shame that the Game Boy Lite was never released outside of Japan, but it's now easier to buy imported systems, and the Game Boy is region free, so it might be fun to get a Game Boy Lite. Game Boy Color. What it plays. Gray original Game Boy cartridges, black Game Boy cartridges, transparent Game Boy Color cartridges. In 1998, Nintendo released an updated version of the Game Boy, but with a screen capable of color, but not with a backlit screen. It also featured a faster processor that was 100% compatible with the original Game Boy. When you play a select number of Nintendo-made Game Boy games on a Game Boy Color, it will make the sprites a different color, and it can make it a little easier to see, but it's not exactly the same as it was on the original Game Boy. You can switch through these optional palettes by holding down different buttons or direction on the D-pad when starting up the unit with an original Game Boy game inserted. Game Boy Color cartridges with a black design will work on both the original Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. With the Game Boy Color, you have the option to play both original Game Boy games and new Game Boy Color games, so it might be an excellent option for you. Game Boy Advance. What it plays. Gray original Game Boy cartridges, black Game Boy cartridges, transparent Game Boy Color cartridges, and Game Boy Advance cartridges. Nintendo designed a 32-bit Game Boy system called the Game Boy Advance that had a wide screen, much higher graphical capabilities, but still remained backwards compatible with the original line of Game Boy games and Game Boy Color games. The original Game Boy Advance design is wider and is a bit of a different direction for the form factor. Original Game Boy cartridges also stick out a bit more, and the original Game Boy Advance was not backlit. Game Boy Advance SP. What it plays. gray original Game Boy cartridges, black Game Boy cartridges, transparent Game Boy Color cartridges, Game Boy Advance cartridges. The Game Boy Advance line got a significant hardware revision in the form of the Game Boy Advance SP. It had a backlit LCD screen, a clamshell design that can fold up and easily fit in your pocket, and it was still able to play original Game Boy games, Game Boy Color games, and Game Boy Advance games. Only original Game Boy games stick out a bit on the Game Boy Advance SP, but it is an excellent choice for people who want one system that can play every generation of Game Boy game. I also like the fact that it has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily replaced over the years. However, they did take out the headphone jack. I don't know exactly why they couldn't figure out how to fit a headphone jack, but Nintendo giveth and Nintendo taketh away. There are also different versions of the Game Boy Advance SP with different max brightness levels for the screen. But for a lot of gamers, including myself, I have a really special place in my heart for the Game Boy Advance SP, and I own two.
Game Boy Micro. The Game Boy Micro is system hardware from Nintendo, which on one hand could only be from Nintendo with its intricate design, diminutive form factor, and simplicity. But at the same time, it doesn't actually feel like something from Nintendo because rather than going for mass market appeal, they went after a hardcore Nintendo fan. It is fan service in hardware. It is the smallest possible game system that can play Game Boy Advance games without completely cramping your hand. It has a premium metal finish and built-in rechargeable battery and pretty detailed little tiny screen. However, it can play Game Boy Advance games and that's it. Despite being labeled as a Game Boy, it is the only Game Boy that cannot play the original Game Boy games. Nintendo clearly didn't intend for this system to be for everybody, but it seems like a love letter to hardcore Nintendo fans. Nintendo DS and DS Lite. The Nintendo DS and DS Lite can play Game Boy Advance games using the cartridge slot on the bottom, but they cannot play original Game Boy cartridges or Game Boy Color cartridges. However, the Game Boy Advance cartridges look amazing on the DS Lite screen, and the form factor is very comfortable for gamers with larger hands. You also have the option to play them on the top or bottom LCD screen. The DSi and 3DS cannot play Game Boy Advance cartridges.
Modded original Game Boy. There are now aftermarket backlit LCD screens and backlight mods for the original Game Boy DMG. It can still take some electronic skill to install them, but there's quite the market for people willing to install and customize Game Boy hardware. Modded Game Boy Advance. There is also a healthy Game Boy Advance hacker scene and a lot backlit LCD options for the Game Boy Advance. It seems that the Game Boy Advance is a lot easier to open up and modify than the Game Boy Advance SP. A lot of retro game shops might have the kits and many can help you install them or sell pre-modded systems. There is a huge Game Boy hacker market out there for people who refurbish, reshell, restore, and upgrade original Game Boy Advance systems. Modded Game Boy Advance SP. It is a little bit trickier to install new screens and shells on the much more compact Game Boy Advance SP, but there's also a pretty healthy Game Boy Advance SP hacking scene out there. Hawthorne Game Exchange in Portland, Oregon had a pre-modified Game Boy Advance SP with a really sweet transparent green shell and IPS LCD screen, and I had quite a bit of trading credit and I cashed it in for this bad boy. It is so nice on the eyes. Official Nintendo TV Game Boy systems. Super Game Boy. What it plays. Original gray Game Boy cartridges and black Game Boy cartridges.
In 1994, Nintendo released the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo and the Super Famicom. It is simply a modified Game Boy circuit board built into a specialized Super Nintendo cartridge. This allows you to play Game Boy games on a CRT TV with a Super Nintendo, and it also works on every modern Super Nintendo clone system or an original Super Nintendo using HDMI adapters. The CPU ran ever so slightly faster, but most gamers can't even notice it, and they didn't include a networking port for the Game Boy link cable, which wouldn't be a problem except for a little game called Pokemon. Super Game Boy 2, what it plays: original gray Game Boy cartridges and black Game Boy cartridges. In 1998, Nintendo released an updated version of the Super Game Boy in Japan called the Super Game Boy 2. It had a pretty sweet transparent blue shell, and it had a Game Boy link cable port for trading your Pokemons. It also had a 100% accurate same-speed CPU. Now, you can actually play this on an American Super Nintendo if you just snip off the little plastic tabs inside your cartridge slot. A lot of people thought that the Super Game Boy 2 could play Game Boy Color games, but unfortunately, it cannot. It is a shame because they don't work on the Super Game Boy 2, but aesthetically, they're so very similar with both awesome transparent shell designs. It would have been peak 90s Nintendo. It's a shame that it never came out in the US, but Nintendo of America was getting ready to roll out the Game Boy Color in 1998. I recently picked up a Super Game Boy 2 from Tapper's Retro Games and Toys, and it is a really awesome piece of Nintendo history that is quite handy. Game Boy Player for GameCube. What it plays: gray original Game Boy cartridges, black Game Boy cartridges, transparent Game Boy Color cartridges, Game Boy Advance cartridges. But not the motion control ones unless you're going to pick up and twist around your GameCube system. Nintendo made a Game Boy Advance that fits on the underside of the Nintendo GameCube. This plays original Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance games. However, this was made in an era when it was fashionable to have pixel games with a high amount of blur, and even the so-called sharp mode isn't as sharp as I would like it to be. Also, the Game Boy Player boot disc has gotten quite rare as kids have thrown it out while keeping the Game Boy Player hardware around. Hacker-made Game Boy Player software running on a modded GameCube can give you a crisp Game Boy Player TV experience. A working set of the Game Boy Player and original Game Boy Player boot disc can set you back around $200 these days, but it is worth it. Official Nintendo portable emulation on the 3DS and Nintendo Switch. Also, the 3DS Virtual Console Store, but I'm not going to go into that because it's already closed. There is also a small selection of Game Boy Advance, and Game Boy Color games on the Nintendo Switch Online service that you can rent access to with a Nintendo Switch Online subscription. Handheld Emulators. There is also a huge variety of Linux and Android-based portable gaming emulator devices that have no problems playing Game Boy games. Many of these have a nice and bright IPS LCD screens and have the ability to deliver a handheld portable Game Boy-like experience, but with save states, rechargeable batteries, filters, and the ability to run games from ROMs and not cartridges. They are also smaller, more compact than original hardware ever was. Anbernic and Powkitty have a huge product line of handheld emulation systems. Personally, I'm a big fan of the Mu Mini Plus with Onion OS, and I need to do a video on how much I love my Mu Mini Plus. EverDrives. The EverDrive GBX7 is able to play pretty much every single standard Game Boy and Game Boy Color game, and it even has save states and works on every authentic Game Boy system. I do also collect original cartridges, especially the Japanese ones, but having an EverDrive lets me play just about every single game on original hardware, which is really convenient if you're making a YouTube channel like this. The EverDrive GBA Mini supports almost every single Game Boy Advance game, except for the ones that require special motion sensors and such. It also has a real-time clock for your Pokemons, and it works in all original hardware, and even the Game Boy player for GameCube. It can even run NES, Game Boy, and Game Boy Color games on the Game Boy Advance in emulation mode, which is pretty cool. I really recommend that you buy authentic EverDrives instead of knockoff clone ones, as they tend to be a lot slower and aren't as rock solid and authentic as EverDrives. Slavia Ukrainia. Analogue Pocket FPGA Portable Game System. Analogue is currently taking pre-orders for the next batch of Analogue Pocket FPGA Portable Game Systems in black and white colors, which is great because I actually made a video about my mildly sarcastic complaints that I had with their limited edition colored pre-order systems. The Analogue Pocket is an FPGA-based masterpiece. It meticulously recreates the Game Boy's hardware in FPGA circuits with a modern high-resolution screen, delivering a pixel-perfect experience with near-zero latency or blur. I actually got a chance to play on an Analogue Pocket at a friend's place, and I was pretty impressed with the high build quality and phenomenal accuracy. The Analogue Pocket can play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance games natively off cartridges, and there are a series of adapters allowing for Game Gear, Atari Lynx, Neo Geo Pocket, and even open FPGA support for a wide variety of other game systems. If I didn't have my hands already full with original Nintendo Game Boy hardware, I would absolutely get an Analogue Pocket. Clone emulation TV systems. Hyperkin actually makes two consoles that can play Game Boy games on a modern HDMI TV via emulation. There is the Hyperkin Retron 5 that can do a variety of game systems, and the Hyperkin Retron S, which can handle the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance line of games. You can play them on a big screen and use wireless controllers. And in Japan, there is a popular Retro Freak emulation console. However, since these systems are based on software emulation and are not cloned hardware, they do not work with EverDrives or multicarts, which is a shame. Computer Game Boy emulation. Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance hardware is easily emulated, and you can run Game Boy games on a RetroPie and pretty much every single modern computer, even Android phones. RetroArch has some pretty good filters for recreating the original Game Boy Matrix and LCD blur. It works, but it's just not as cozy as actually having the game system in your hand. I think that the Game Boy Color is right at a sweet spot where a lot of retro gaming collectors aren't paying a lot of attention to it, but there are a lot of great games for it. With the exception of the big Nintendo games, most other Game Boy Color games are still mostly very affordable. However you play Game Boy Color games, make sure you have a fun time doing it. Also, make sure that you are subscribed because next week I'm going to cover essential Game Boy Advance games. If you haven't checked out my video on essential Game Boy games, make sure that you do so, and I'll have a link below and at the end of the video. This is 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome, play retro.